Can you see the image I posted? Because for me, it just shows the little file icon.
Let me see if I can see it. Yeah, I can't see it. How did you post it?
I just kind of slid it into the thing. I guess that's the wrong way to do it.
Yeah, you can't drag and drop or copy and paste don't work. You'll remember the way you'll want to add that. Let me go here. Reply. The way to add it is you see how it says insert or edit image.
Oh, okay.
So you'll do that and pick it. That will work. So please make sure you're doing your attendance post. I really don't want to have to drop you from class just because of not just missing a post. Okay, so you saw that there was a few videos posted yesterday in terms of lecture. It looks like most people got through a chance to read those or watch through those from these three: creating a new Express app, adding Bootstrap and jQuery to that, and then adding Handlebars. So were there any questions about that process of adding Handlebars to your application?
Yeah, I got one that's hopefully pretty simple, but when you have a nav bar, yeah, I'm trying to standardize whatever is going to be in the main, and the nav bar has an active link on it.
Uh-huh.
It's a class you put on there, so that kind of messes up the standardization across the board. Is there a way to attack that?
Right. So the thing that you'll need to do there it is basically you need to pass some additional data to your view to say, what is the active link, right? You need some additional data to do that.
It's like the text success and text primary, something like that.
No, you just need enough data to know what the current page is. Okay, so if I'm thinking about like here, right, I've already passed the title, right? I'm passing data in. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so what data, and anybody can answer this, what data do I need to know what the current page is? What kind of data do I need to add?
Well, it would be the name of the file itself and handlebars, I would say. So if it's contact.handlebars, then that would mean that would have the active link, right?
Do I need the .handlebars? I need some way to know what the page is, but that can be just the name of the page. So for instance, one easy way to work around that is to just say, well, what page am I on? I'm page home, right? Or here I'm on the contact page, right? So I could say page contact, because I can pass any data I want as part of this object.
Yeah, the name page, that's just arbitrary. That's just like a marker, right? Like a variable name.
It's arbitrary, yeah, you're right. It's a variable name. But it's now something I can use, right? Or I could call this active. It doesn't matter which one, what I call this, I can call it whatever I want. But now that I've got that variable, whether I call it page, I call it active, I call it something else, you can see now I know which page it's trying to render, right?
Right. So would you have one of those if-else statements that would be in the nav bar, like deliver this setup if it's okay?
So then I
That'd
can
be
just
a
put
very
an
busy
if else
if-else.
I can just put an if else on there and say, if the active page, whether I call it page or active, I can say if that variable is home, then you see it as active. If it's not home, then it's not active. If it's contact, it's active. If it's not contact, it's inactive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got to see how it'll work and how easy it is to implement. But yeah, I got the idea.
Yeah. You just have to add some additional data to know which one is active. So, I mean, if I'm thinking about this, right, that home link, right, what would my if look like? What characters do I need to put there? And
You got it's a hashtag with an if inside of, is it a double curly braces?
So typically, if I'm going to put double curly braces is like this. I'm just saying put the content there that I gave it, but it'll escape any HTML. Versus if I put triple braces, it's going to not escape the HTML, which is something I need here because I wanted to put the HTML directly. But okay, so if what? So if active is home, otherwise I want it to just display it regularly. So this one I need to have active in the classes. So let me run that application. Okay, it's up and running. Localhost 3000. Am I the only one here? It sounds very quiet. Wow.
Here. Yeah, we're here. We're just not saying anything.
I'm here. I'm just listening.
Yeah. Okay. I think I need to put the word equals. Let me try that.
Yeah, you just saved me an hour with that right there by typing that out.
I'm missing something, but it's basically that. Let's see, handlebars if equals. So remember, it's a weird. What's the weird syntax that I need to do? Oh, okay. That's the way they write it as EQ. Okay. EQ space active's the name of the variable, and then the value I want it to be. Missing helper. What? I'm missing something. Not quite right. Like, why does it not like that? Oh, no, that's part of something else. I'm going to go to built-in helpers. Sub-expression. So, does if only take a boolean? I guess it only takes a boolean. Let's try that. I might be missing something. Active equals home. Why is it complaining about? that's not as simple as I thought it was. Okay, so it looks to me like, at least the mention on there looks like there may be. That's very odd that it wouldn't just take a Boolean. If is defined. So I guess basically there's not an equals operator built into Handlebars, so you kind of have to define one. You have to basically kind of define a helper function. So you're with me with this kind of so far? The idea is I need to get a Boolean here, right? So as it turns out, it doesn't really like the fact, it doesn't really like my syntax. So if I said equals equals, it didn't actually like that. So one of the things I need to add then would be a helper function, which a helper function kind of lets you add additional logic to Handlebars, additional functions. So this EQ function right now doesn't exist, so it's complaining. But you can kind of build in your own helpers. Now, where is some expression? Write a helper. So they're kind of showing you how to do it here. Handlebars.registerhelper, right? So we're giving it a name. But the question is, where do I do something like this? Where do I register that helper? What file do I need to go to do that?
Would you want to do it in the server? Go ahead, Donna. Sorry.
Would you want to do it in the server?
I probably want to do it in the server, right? Now, what might not be clear, one of the things that might not be clear there, just looking at that, it's like, well, I don't have anything named uppercase Handlebars, right? This is kind of coming out of blue. So what I need to do, I believe that's the HBS object that we're having here. It's either that or the class, but I believe it's this one. So I need an actual reference to that object to be able to work with it, which right now you see I'm just passing it to this engine function. So I need to actually take that and save it to a variable. Let's say maybe save it as HBS. Right? Well, what's my problem here?
You had two defined HBS variables, I guess.
Right. I have HBS already here. I can't just call it again. So I might need to give this a different name. Maybe we call this view engine. So I can pass it in here and have it be a separate name. Now, to that view engine, I need to give this helper. So let's say here, now I'm not getting register helper. Let's check real quick. We just need to try it. Let's see, HBS. So it's not suggesting it at all. But we get on either of those. So I'm going to guess it's this one though. So view engine dot register helper. Sometimes finding the methods, unfortunately, in JavaScript can be kind of weird because it's not easy to just like look up what's the method this class has. So here in EQ, let's say we got value A and we've got value B, and what I want to do is say A equals So let's say I do that. Now what is it telling me here? View engine register function is not a function. Okay, so what if I do HBS? So neither of those are working for me. So Express handlebars register helper. Let's see what we got it. Oh, okay. So it's a parameter. It's a parameter to the constructor. Okay. So that's where I need that to be. Okay. Let me fix that. So I don't need to create this view engine variable. I just need to pass it in as as argument to that constructor. Okay. So in the HBS, right, we're constructing the engine here. We need to pass in object, attribute name helpers. Okay. And then for the helpers, I kind of give them as properties as well. So EQ is equal to that. A B takes 2 arguments and is going to return A equals B. I think that's what I want. Let's give that a quick try. So define it here. Is it happy now? Ah, there we go. So you might be able to see where it's kind of highlighted. The home is highlighted.
Yeah.
So sometimes for doing things like that, sometimes you have to kind of create your own helpers, additional functions that you can use here. So I had to create an equals function basically to say that these two values are the same.
Okay, for our lab, is this beyond the scope or what's reasonable for where we're at this time?
I mean,
Or should we
I
just...
think it's something you need to read up on, but it wasn't something that, I mean, this was not something I asked you guys to do, to set it active versus inactive, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can you show the code for how you created
Yeah.
yeah.
I'll just
Okay.
put it in Discord so that everybody's got a copy of it.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's not something I necessarily expected for you to figure out yourself at this point, but it's also not really something I asked for. So, but that's how I would do it. Should you need to do that, and you can define a bunch of functions that way. You're just saying, hey, I take in such and such inputs, and that's what I want to do with it. Any other questions on handlebars? I mean, you're really just kind of getting a dip in the water with it yet, because I just want to get you started with it and kind of understand where, okay, now I've got a template, right? I've got my layout, and I can do some more dynamic views. So if you look at the playlist, I've actually added a lot of videos to it today. So one that I went and recorded today, and you already saw the notification about that one maybe, is I did a quick video about how to get your application deployed to Heroku. One thing you'll need to know to do that, you do have to have your application as actually a separate repo. So you won't be able to directly push anything from your coursework repo out to Heroku because it's kind of a 1-to-1 ratio, if that makes sense. So one of the things that you'll need to do is create another repository to enable you to do that. Okay. So I think probably the easiest way for me to manage that, I need to give you a link. I'll do another assignment on GitHub Classroom. You saw how you have your coursework repo. I can set up another assignment to follow that to create another repo for your portfolio. And that way you'll kind of start with another repo for them. Questions there?
Will there be a new repo for each assignment, for each lab, or is it just for all the labs?
Well, for things that specifically you want to deploy to Heroku, that needs to be a separate repo, basically. So, like my let's see if I can get to GitHub. So, because what Heroku needs to be able to deploy it needs you to just have a single app there, and the package.json needs to be at the root. Does that make sense?
Is it a web host ran through GitHub?
It's a web host. It's a separate company, but basically what you can do, and Heroku is not the only one that does this. You push your project up to GitHub and you connect Heroku, and it'll kind of watch it and automatically deploy any new changes that you make to it.
Ooh.
Yeah, so it's actually really, once you get everything wired up, it's actually super easy because you just commit changes and now they're on the internet. So it's really easy to set up. So I did a video about how to do the setup for that. What I didn't include in there was how to make another repo, if that makes sense.
Why would most people just use this to host their website? Like, say, for our first semester projects, it seems like a pretty sweet deal.
So you can't host static content directly on Heroku. That's the caveat. You have to have a kind of a shell or a container to put it in. So if you take like an Express server that we have, right? We created a very simple one to serve up some static content, and the important part being that, app use Express static. If you add if you set things up to be an Express app, you take your static content, turn it into an Express app, you can put it up there. But the problem is you can't just put, here's my HTML, my CSS files, if that makes sense.
That's not much of a catch, though.
It's not much of a catch. It's not hard to set up. It's really easy. It's fairly easy to convert a static website to an Express application, but it does have to be like a Node or Express application in order for it to, actually be uploaded to Heroku. So also just making some calendar updates to try and sync up with where we're at. So general expectation for today and homework. So I do want you, if you haven't watched the Handlebars video that I recorded yesterday, go ahead and make sure you watch through that. There's that video about deploying your application to Heroku, which I want you to go through with your portfolio project specifically. And then there's also a bunch of videos that I've added to perusal related to Handlebars to get some more deeper understanding of what Handlebars is and how to use it. But the main part that I wanted to record specifically was how does that apply to our class. So that's the part that kind of I recorded yesterday is how does it connect to where we are at in class. So there's a series of 6 videos here. about Express, and then there's also the official documentation. That's really what I want you to go through. I think you'll get a lot more out of it. Learn some more things that you need to know about Express through that. That's kind of the place of my lecture today is to go through that series of tutorials. But we've also got the one about Heroku.
Sweet.
I do want to answer, some questions, and I think, some of there's a little bit of bearing on, kind of explaining what Express is and such, because I think that you kind of have an introduction to it now, but I think we maybe skipped over some of the theory bits, which are kind of important. So I know, Paul, you had a question about, for instance, well, what is this routing thing, right, in Express?
Yeah, I've seen the documents, the first reading assignment, and I'm thinking, what in the hell are we doing here? I didn't understand it. I mean, I get the logic part of it, but why? Because most people that are going to a website are going to go to the homepage to look for the nav links. They're not going to just randomly guess, oh, let me put in /contact. Nobody does that. Well, somewhat, but it seems like a kind of an in vain activity. So maybe we think, why are we even doing it?
Well, so that routing, the users are not entering those addresses. But what you're doing is you're setting up, you need some logic to happen on the back end. So what what you learned in first semester is how to build static content, right? You say, I want index.html, and you get index.html. But what if in the process to generate that page, you actually have to run some code before you can give them the HTML, such as having to go get some data from the database, right? So you need to define a route to say, here's the logic that I want you to execute when you ask for this resource. And that doesn't mean, those routes, the user doesn't have to type in the URL to get to those routes. They just need to, if you've got a nav bar, right, is probably one of the ways they're going to get around, right? If they click on a nav bar in the nav bar, they go to the contact page or whatever, which I think I have this open, right? So if I click on this, I'm going to /contact, right? I think my server stopped. Why is my server not running? There we go. So, when I'm going here, I'm going to / or the home. Here I'm going to contact, right? Is there a file actually named contact?
No.
There's not really, right? So this routes kind of say, the whole point of the routing is to say, here's a URL, and I want you to do this when the user asks for this URL. But that doesn't imply that they're typing in that URL. Okay, they could get to that easily. They're probably going to get there through a link from another page. But typing in the URL and following a link is the same difference to the web server. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I got it. You're not going to just standard where it's always going to be the same response. It's more of like a command to bring back something like that.
Yeah.
That resembles what you would expect on a contact page, because that might update.
Right. So even just looking at, if we're looking at how I built out the post route, right? When I say let's respond to the form being submitted, am I just saying let's return contact.html?
No, you got a lot going on there.
Right? I need to run some logic, and then at the end, I'm actually rendering a view, right? I'm rendering this contact view, and that contact view then I'm putting data into. So if I just had static files, that I wouldn't have a place to put my backend code. So your routes are kind of this. You can think of more as functions. They're like, here's the path that you go to in the browser, and here's what the function that gets executed when you go to that path. That's a route.
Okay, for a lot of these more static type pages that we're doing, if we're going to redo the code there, it would be super simple, right? App.post, and it would be just, I guess it would just be the slash because it's home, and then the two parameters, the arrow, and then it would just be to what? Just put the page up, right? Because you wouldn't have logic. There's no gathering of or setting of variables. It would just return that, and that's it, right?
What does app.post do? What is that? What kind of method is that in response to?
Well,
Daniel, you were talking?
I was just going to say, it's not on a submission of a form?
Right. It's a post method, right? And submission of a form. So this is in response to a post method, which you get if you submit a form as post. If I'm just putting it into the address bar following a link, it's a GET request. So like your home page is always going to be a GET. If the user's just navigating around, whether following links or typing it in the address bar, that's just going to be a GET request. So it would be app GET, not app post.
Every page would have an app get, but not everyone will have a post. The post would be for forms.
Right. Post is only if you have a form that you need to handle. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, theory-wise. So you've gotten introduced to this idea of Express, and it's a tool in your tool belt now. The kind of the whole goal of Express is to be able to build very extensible applications very quickly. Okay, with a lot less code than you might need just writing things in Node. And again, kind of that extensible part, meaning that you can easily add things into it without re-architecting your application, right? So let's say I want to add, for instance, I want to say, let's add authentication, right? Let's add a user, a login screen of some sort, and keep track of users and what their roles are, what permissions do users have. I can build that with Node, but it's a lot harder to kind of put that in because there's not really extension points with Node. You with me?
Yeah.
You can kind of think of taking a base class and adding more methods to it. So that's a lot easier to do with Express. So Express is an abstraction of that HTTP module. So you've got that lower layer of the HTTP module, which is part of Node. Express kind of builds on top of that. And sometimes you actually have to go back because maybe there's some holes sometimes in the Express API. Sometimes I do have to go back and look at the documentation for the HTTP module to go see how that functions, because the HTTP module is still there underneath. Your request and your response objects are still, they still have all the methods that they do with the HTTP module. So sometimes you'll need to look up that documentation. Okay. As I was kind of saying, that part of the reason of using Express is it makes it quicker to build application, and it also makes it easier to extend those applications, to add new functionality to it. So that's our goal. There's three really pieces that there's really only three pieces that come with Express. One is the routing piece. The second is the middleware piece, and the third is the views piece. So we've started using all three of those pieces a little bit, but there's more to each of those pieces, right? So if we're talking about the routing, right, that's kind of what's going on here, right? We're setting up routes. Is everybody with me?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're setting up routes. you're kind of seeing here this app.use. Here we're starting to see something called middleware. Anytime you use the word app.use, you're installing some middleware. Okay, and there's actually a little bit, there's more to it than that, and we'll come back to that later, because this is not the only way to bring in middleware. Also, you can see the app.use with the static content. Again, this is anytime you're using app.use, you're actually installing middleware. So this Express static is one kind of middleware. This Express, the URL encoder, is kind of a subclass of what we call body parser. It parses the body of the request and gives you that body object. So both of those things are middleware. So that's one part. That's kind of the second part of that. And then we talked about views yesterday, right? So and a little bit today. What are those? What's the technology, the other library that we're using to implement our views? Troy, yours.
I thought I had it, but
Handlebars?
Handlebars, right? So we're using the Handlebars view engine. Okay, it is not the only one. Handlebars is not the only view engine that you can use. But you do really need, you can install a view engine, and you can potentially use it without having Express. But it means that you have to set up a lot more code to just get in the basics of, here I've got a view engine and how do I connect it to my server. So Express provides a very quick kind of interface to install a variety of different view engines. So Handlebars is the one we'll be using. There's another one out there called EJS, which I see a number of people using now. There's another one called Pug and Jade. There's a very long list of different view engines that are available. Part of the benefit of using Handlebars is that it's, as you can tell, it's really close to HTML, right? You can basically write HTML and then add the little Handlebars bits. Yep.
misclick, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So some of the other ones like Pug and Jade really have you write your HTML in a very different syntax. So now you have to learn that other syntax to write your code. So that's part of why we're using Handlebars. Is A, it's a popular one, but also B, is it doesn't mean completely redoing all of our HTML. We can still write HTML tags and whatnot, mostly as we're familiar with just adding in a few, dynamic bits. So that's why we're picking that one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of the layers of an application and how does that fit in. And this may help with explaining where the routing piece is. But the first thing I want to really look is what is this idea of middleware? It'll make more sense when you start kind of looking at what are the different parts of the application that you have. So when we're looking at a web application, what are some of those parts you already know about?
Like actual files, or you mean just like front end and back end?
Well, front end and back end is one part of it. Okay. So
Server?
So we know we've got the front end somewhere here. And I know I've got the back end. Okay. What else?
Is the server part of this?
The server would be part of this. Okay. So let me add in that somewhere here. So
Does the database count as backend?
Okay. Well, that's a good question. That's what we're trying to graph, right? Where do those parts fit? right? So yeah, we're going to have a database, and it's going to be somewhere in here. And yes, it's going to be part of the back end. Okay. What else might you have?
Well, I guess you're going to put middleware in there.
Have to be what?
Middleware.
Middleware? Okay, I'm going to put
Yeah.
middleware somewhere. And just as a guess, it's probably going to go somewhere in the middle. Right? The question is, where does
Hey,
it
something I can understand.
Would you look at that?
right? What else do I have? I have a web server. What connects to the web server? Client, right? We have a few ways that we what terms do we use for that? We can talk about a web client, or what other term do we usually use for that?
Is that a browser, you mean?
Yeah.
User.
So we usually call that the browser. Right? That is a client. But we typically, you can use those interchangeably, but we usually call it the browser is the term that you'll usually hear. Okay, but those terms are interchangeable. I do say web client, not just client, simply because you can actually have clients with any sort of protocol. But specifically here, we're talking about the HTTP protocol, which I should probably add that in here somewhere too. Okay. So somewhere in here, I'm going to have HTTP. Okay. What about on the front end? What are some of those technologies that we use on the front end?
Things like Bootstrap, like jQuery.
Bootstrap.
Okay. So
CSS?
all right, so let me add, say, Bootstrap, and I heard CSS, right?
Yep.
What else do you usually use with CSS?
HTML.
So on the front, we're going to have some HTML, some CSS, some JavaScript,
Would you?
right? So we know that's going to be in here somewhere, right? Or HTML or CSS or JavaScript files. If I'm adding in, say, okay, so I've got jQuery and Bootstrap. Are these front end technologies or back end technologies?
Front end.
They're front end, right? So because they kind of operate inside the browser, right?
Yeah.
So let me give this front end. Let's make this have a box, and we can kind of say, give this a border width 2, and I'm going to kind of wrap that here. So I've got the front end, which is kind of, maybe we can think of it as kind of at the top. And that includes things like your HTML, your jQuery, your Bootstrap. If you have like your Font Awesome, your Google Fonts, etc. This is all front end stuff, right? And so these are kind of built on top of. We can even say that these are kind of built on top of the underlying technologies, right? These use HTML, CSS, and JS. Okay, so you've got those parts kind of that make up the front end, right? That make up how the user perceives it. If we then go to the back end, let me give this again kind of a border. I'm talking about, well, what fits into the back end? Well, on the back end, we've got our web server. And we've got our database somewhere back here. And so when I want my client to talk to my server, right, those two things have to communicate, right? Is that communication one way or is it two way?
Two way.
Can the web server send the client data?
Yes.
Okay. Can the client send the web server data?
Yes.
Okay. So we can send data back and forth, but what about this question? Can the web server send the client data without the client asking for it first?
No.
In general, no. Right? So it always starts with a request at the beginning, right? That comes down to the request comes from the client to the server, and then the response comes from the server back to the client. So I can kind of give these maybe arrows, and that's the wrong one. I want the arrow going this way, and then here. So we've got the request coming in, and we've got the response coming back. Right? Actually, this arrow is on the wrong side. Right? So the client is going to send the server a request, and then that comes back as a response. Okay. What protocol is used to send that request and response?
HTTP.
HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this whole kind of communication back and forth happens over HTTP. Right? So we have HTTP happening back, up and down. Right, so that's a fundamental technology that we need to understand at least somewhat, because that's kind of what underlies our communication. Okay, so when the request comes in, what does the request include? What's inside of that request?
I mean, if we're talking about like website, like a Amazon, it would be like login information and stuff, like the person's cart or stuff like that. I don't know.
Okay, so in general, we might see, credentials. Yeah. What else? What else could I see here?
Whether it was like get or post.
Okay, so that would in general be called the what? Get or post is the
Method.
It's the method, right? So the method could be get, it could be post, it could also actually be put or delete. Okay, it actually can be any of those four. But at the moment we're just talking about get and post.
What is put, real quick?
So
How's that differentiated from the rest?
it's just a different word. Anytime I send a request, I have to send one of these action words. Okay, so by itself, the word put and post are the same. They don't really, out of the box, behave terribly differently. The difference is when we build something called REST APIs, which we'll talk about next week, we basically use one of these as an insert and one of them as an edit or an update.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So
other real quick question. Is the app post with a form? If you put, would that break it?
It won't break it, but it won't break it. But for now, just use post.
Roger. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. You can put on both ends, the server end and the back end. So we've got the method. We might have some credentials in there. What else do we need to send? How do I know what resource you want?
Oh, a file path.
Okay. Or in general, we might say a URL, right? So you need to tell me, what page are you looking for? Are you looking for the contact page, the home page, the products page? Are you looking for information about product X or information about product Y, right?
Yeah.
So the URL gives us those pieces of information, right? What resource are you asking for? So there's a method and there's a URL, and those are in general the kind of those are the parts that are always sent, right? So if I type in the address bar and I say I want to go to contact.html, right? What's the method? It's get, right?
Yeah.
And then the URL is contact.html, right? So it's those two parts together. Yes, you can have credentials. That's a story for another day. But in general, those are kind of the main parts. We also have headers, which, as it turned out, our credentials are usually sent as headers. But there are a lot of other things we can send as headers. Okay, and then there's the body of the request. Okay, so most of the time you don't have a body, except for the case where you're posting a form, right? So this body would include things like form data, right? So if I post a form, that's where I'm going to find it, is in the body of the request. Cool?
Yeah.
Okay. Now with the response, it's kind of similar. It just breaks into two pieces. The response is, well, maybe more than two pieces. There's a status. There is headers. And there is the body. Right? So the status code says, was this successful or not? Right? So do you remember what the status code is for success?
200.
200 success. Okay. Have you ever seen a 404 error code?
Yes.
What does 404 mean?
It does not exist.
Okay, so the resource doesn't exist. The path that you entered, it's like there's no file there. There might have been one in the past, but there's definitely not one now. Okay. Have you ever seen a 500 error code?
Internal server error.
That would be an internal server error, right? So if I see these codes are always 3-digit codes. Anything that starts with a 2 is good. Anything that starts with a 4 means that there's an error, and basically with a 4, you're blaming the error on the client. With the 4, the error's here. With the 500 errors, the error is here. Right? So you're placing the blame based on the error code. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You can also have, for instance, in there a 401 error code, who would be the blame for a 401 error code then?
Client.
Be the client, okay? So like a 401 error code, if I remember right, says that you haven't given me your login credentials. You don't have permission to see this resource.
So is there only 200, 400, and 500s?
There's also 300s. So the 300 range, I think 302, 304 are some of those. When we see a 300 level error code, that's a redirection. It says, okay, I got your request, but the answer to your request is over here. So when you respond with the 300 error code, you're saying, yes, I got it. Now, and then the browser automatically loads the next page that you tell it to load. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So 302 is a redirection. So for instance, if your website moves, you would say, I need to send some sort of 300 error code to say, well, it's no longer at this domain name, it's over at this domain name. Or if you want to force the user to go from an HTTP connection, which is an unsecure connection, to an HTTPS connection, that would be another way to send a 300 error code. We also often will use these 300 codes, these redirection codes, to say, okay, you made your purchase, and now I'm going to redirect you to the next page. So you can see your receipt, if that makes sense. So 200s are a success. 300s are a redirection. 400s are a client error, and 500s are a server error. Cool.
Got it.
When you
So
say
that-
client, does that mean the web client?
Huh?
When you say client error, what does that mean exactly?
The browser.
But I thought, like, let's say they ask for one of your pages of your website and it's not there, isn't that the fault of the back end if they don't have the page there?
I'm having a really hard time hearing your microphone. You're very muffled. But if the web page doesn't exist, it would be a 404 code.
I think his question was, why is that blamed on the client when the web page doesn't have the file?
Well, it's blamed on the web page because we're saying that the user typed in the wrong address. This is where sometimes it falls apart as the categorization, because yes, in general, the idea with a 400 is that it is the client. Here, the idea is that you typed in that the URL was typed in by the user, and the user typed in the wrong URL. But obviously, most of the time when you're following around on a website, you're usually clicking links, right? So if I'm clicking around on links, whose fault is it really that there's a 404 code? Is it the user's fault?
No, that's the web engineer's fault.
Huh? If the link is broken, is that the user's fault?
Yeah, it's just bad design on the website.
Right. So if the link is bad, yes, in reality it's probably not the user's fault. It's probably the fault of whoever's maintaining the website if that link breaks. But by the same token, let's say I'm on Stack Overflow, right? And I post a link to some other article, right? And maybe you look at it 3 years later, that link's broken. Whose fault is it that the link is broken? Is that Stack Overflow's fault? That the link is broken?
No.
It's not, right? So in somewhere there, it's kind of it's the user's fault, if that makes sense. So a 500 means that you have, specifically it means that you generally have an exception on your server that you haven't dealt with. That's what causes 500 errors, is there's an exception on your server and you have not handled that exception. Versus, 404 means that it can't find the page. Okay, so that's your status code, right? You've got headers, similar to how you have headers on the request, and there's actually a lot of overlap between the headers and the request and headers and the response. In both cases, this is metadata, right? Anything that's a header is not the actual document that you're sending or data you're sending back and forth. It's data about the data. Cool?
Yeah, that would be stuff that would be in the head, like the description.
No, actually not.
No.
Your head is still actually part of the body. As far as HTTP concerned, your head is still part of the body. In HTTP sense, the head is still data, actually. So when I'm talking about headers, that's actually the stuff that you don't see. So like if I were to inspect my page, right, everything I see here, that's the actual document, right? You can think of it as there's an HTML document with that data in it, right? But as far as my computer is concerned, is this data, this content here, the head, the body, all that, is that the whole file? Does Windows have to keep more data about it? So let's say I'm looking at the file on my computer. I'll go through here and I'm going to say, let's look at this. Reveal in File Explorer. So I've got my layout file here, right? And I can open it up in Notepad. And I can see everything that's inside of there, right? So I can see I've got like a head with some meta data and a body, right? But this is kind of, all of this is the document itself, right? This whole thing is the document itself. What else is there? Well, there's, as Windows in the file system, there's a name for the file, right? Main.handlebars, right? That's the name of the file. Is there some other data that's contained in here that you see?
Maybe like file size?
So there's the file size, right? That's information about the file. There's date modified. When was the last date that it was modified? And we have also what kind of file is it, right? It's a .handlebars that's kind of conveyed in the extension, but actually as far as HTTP is concerned, that's not conveyed in the extension. It's not conveyed in the file name. Cool. So this is all metadata, right? So you always have metadata that's not contained in your HTML document. Is everybody with me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So that additional metadata that's not in your document, and again, this is not talking about the head of your HTML document. That stuff is the header. The stuff that's not contained, the metadata that's not contained in the actual document goes back and forth as headers. So, for instance, like you can think about the status code, right? Is the status code part of your HTML document?
No.
It's not part of the document. It's part of the response, right? So this body here, this is where we actually get to the document. The body of the response is the actual document that you're seeing. So the body contains all of this. Or if you're sending back CSS, right, this would be the entire CSS file. If I'm sending back an image, that's the body of the response. Okay, so you always have a status code, and you have headers, and you have a body to that response. Any questions on those response and request objects now?
Nope.
Okay. So let's say, so we've got our HTTP here. We know that that's the communication mechanism that we have here. So we talked about the languages that are being used in the. We talked about the languages that are being used here. Oh, come on! I want to move that over. I don't know why I didn't select everything, but there. I need some more space. So on the server side, right, we know that on the client side we have to write things in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But on the server side, what language can I write my server in?
Node and Express.
Okay, so I could write it with Node, but what language is that?
JavaScript.
JavaScript. So I could write it with JavaScript, or some other languages that I could use back here.
C#.
C#.
Python.
Python. I could use maybe PHP.
Perl.
I could use Perl. I could write this backend in Perl. That'd be fine. I could even write it in like C or C++ if I really felt like going through all that pain.
Being old-fashioned.
Right? I can do that, and I might make a really efficient server for some small things, but I'm not going to build a very big application with that. So on the back end, it can really be any technology that you want it to be. With the front end, it has to be this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because it needs to run in the browser, right? And the browser only understands those three languages. But on the back end, as long as it talks over HTTP, it doesn't matter what language the back end's written in. Right? The browser knows how to talk HTTP. So any web server that can talk HTTP, it can talk to. Cool?
Yeah.
So what that means is this request and the response object, are those there if I'm writing a C# server?
Yeah.
Are they any different?
Nope.
I don't think they would be.
They won't be, right? So these things are defined by HTTP. So definitely pay attention to that, because even if you change the technology on the back end, you're still gonna have those things. You're still gonna have HTTP going back and forth. So those are kind of critical pieces to understand for how this whole thing works. Okay. So we're writing our JavaScript, our servers specifically this semester. We're writing them in JavaScript. Last year we wrote them in C#. But so this year we're writing them in JavaScript. On the web server, okay. Well, we're using JavaScript, and specifically, if I kind of want to look at the stack of things that are directly here. We have JavaScript, we have Node, and we have Express, right? These are kind of the three core pieces of what we actually see kind of implementing our web server. Okay, is those three pieces. at least the way we're building it this semester. Okay, so when a request comes in, right, we've built our application. What handles that request?
The handlebar.
Handlebars doesn't handle the request.
Well, you went straight to the handlebars thing, so I just
I know.
assumed. So, my bad.
What am I telling to listen as my last step? What am I telling to listen on port 3000?
The app.
The app,
Or
which
the server.
is an Express app, right?
Yes, sir.
So when this request comes in, it's going to go, basically it goes first to the HTTP module in Node, and then Express kind of wraps that. So our interface with the request and the response cycle is through Express, right? Our interface to this getting a request and then delivering a response, we're hooking that up through Express. Cool? We're integrating into that lifecycle. Now, when I want to integrate, when I want to connect into that lifecycle, that request response lifecycle, let's say I want to have a hook and say I want to run this code when the URL in the method is this, right? Well, that's what I'm doing with my routes, right? I'm saying if the browser makes a request and it's referring to the root and it's a GET request, if it's a GET request to the root, then run this logic. Run that function.
We would want to make a route for each type of request method, right?
You only need for the ones where you don't want it to be a 404.
Okay.
So by default, it's basically a 404. Does that make sense? By default, it's like, well, I don't have a route for that. I can't find it.
Yeah.
So if you don't define a route for it, then it's going to get a 404. So for instance, we haven't defined for this root path, we haven't defined what happens if you do a post request or a put request or delete request. All of those things will end up getting a 404. Questions?
Nope.
So those are that's kind of where my routes fit in. They're kind of an extension point to this server to say, what do you do when the user asks for this file, right? You're kind of creating like, hey, what is /contact? What do I do when they ask for that file? You run this logic and that gives you contact. So kind of behind there we have that. Also in this process, so this is kind of where middleware fits in, right? So middleware deals in general with kind of handling that request. So if I say I get in a request, it needs to maybe do some processing with the data before I actually handle the request. It kind of sits in the middle, as you might say. So the middleware usually is kind of connected with that HTTP, and it's going to happen before we get to our route. So we'll have the middleware, and then the middleware will next go to, after it goes through the middleware, it goes through the route, which the route is then what gets the response back. So you hit your middleware first, and then if the middleware says it's okay and it's passed everything, it passes on to the route, and then finally the route sends back the response. Does that make sense? So things you commonly see in there, we saw the URL encoded. That's specifically a kind of body parser, which parses the body that we send there and turns it into data that we can use. Now, it's not necessarily true that it's always going to be form data. This might be, for instance, JSON's a really common one that's used here, or it could even be XML, right? So what you're sending here as the body can actually be a lot of different things, and you use the proper parser for that kind of thing there. So if we're sending form data, we need that URL encoded data for parser. If we're using JSON, we need a JSON parser. Or if we're using XML, we need an XML parser in there. Another common thing you're going to see in there is authentication for logins and those credentials. So that's usually where we process that kind of thing, is in the middleware before we deliver you your admin page or whatever it may be.
In this class, are we going to be using Express most of the time?
We'll be using Express all the time. So.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be using Express all the time. Okay, so then the database is kind of, it's, last piece in here, the database is kind of sitting behind, it's usually considered part of the backend. It may be your database might be on the same machine where you're doing the web server. Oftentimes it's actually on another computer entirely. So your database is kind of hidden back here in the back end, but it may actually not be part of your web server. It may actually be a separate entity in itself. And typically the place that connects is going to be in your route. So usually somewhere in the route, you'll have a connection to the database. Will then go need to retrieve or modify some data in the database, which is kind of where you're storing the data.
Hey, did you just ask a question? I kind of zoned out for a second.
I was just saying the database is kind of back here as potentially a different server, different machine. Yeah. So that usually connects to your route. Will then usually say, hey, I need to go get this data, or I need to go save this data. Maybe you're editing an article or you're editing a product in your store. That then needs to go to the database to actually initiate that action. And then usually once the route is kind of done, that's where your views, your handlebars comes into play. It'll go say, okay, I've got the data that I need, and now I want to give back an HTML document, right? So when it needs to then take the data that it got from the database or got from any sort of other source, we need to then make it look pretty. So and make it usable. So I'll take my data, pass it off to a view, and that's what actually is going to turn it into the thing that goes back. So that's where we're seeing in the code, right? So we make a request to the contact page here, for instance, and I'm making a get request to contact. Okay, it says, all right, here's the data I need. Actually, it's all the data it needs to render the page. It just needs to know, what page is active and what's the title of that page. We'll send that on to the contact view, and that's the one that's going to get rendered. So we've got the response. We say render this view as the response.
Yeah, about that line, that contact there,
Yep.
in the line that's highlighted, that has to match up with the handlebars name, right? The contact.handlebars.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it has to match up with a file by that name. So we've got contact.handlebars, Or here I've got home, so that matches up with home.handlebars.
Okay.
If I've got you can see if I've got this one, well, I have to, I'm saying if there's a post request here, I'm saying if there's a GET request. If it's a post request to that URL, then go run that logic, yada, yada. At the end of the day, we say render. So that render is that last thing we do. We say render the response as HTML, use this view and this data.
So without Express, would this just be incredibly complex with hundreds of lines of code?
You're saying without Express?
Yeah, right. Because I don't really have an appreciation for it because I don't know what it's like without it.
That's the catch, is it's saving you code. Because this, first of all, it's saving you code on that end, but it's also saving you code on this end. It's saving you code at the beginning and saving you code at the end. If I pull up, let me see if I open desktop node 1. We kind of started building something out with just using Node, remember? But this is what it started looking like just for a basic setup, right? So I've kind of got this request and response object just like I have with Express, but then rather than being able to set up these routes, I have to write a bunch of if-elses to say, well, what logic should you do? That makes sense? Here I'm implementing the routing with if-else and if and else's. You with me? Does it help, Paul?
Yes, thanks.
So this is our routing here.
So routing is just a better version of doing if else's in a sense.
Basically it. You're saying here's my map of things that these pages exist, right? And you're just basically saying, rather than writing a bunch of if-else's, it allows you to break it up actually into smaller functions.
Yeah, so you don't have to do so many if-else's, you just have to do like 2 or 3 routes.
Right. So like I could actually have taken each of these 3 functions, each of these 3 if blocks, and broken them into my own functions, but then I'm kind of building Express myself, right? So it gives us a structure that we can easily, kind of more normally break things out. So that we have these as like, well, here's a function for the home page. Here's a function for the contact and another one for the contact, right? Rather than having all 3 of those things all in one big function. The other thing that's going to happen as our applications get bigger, we don't even want to put all this stuff in one file, right? We're going to start to want to break this up into multiple files. So Express helps us there too, with having the routes broken up into multiple files. Whereas that's something we'd have to kind of build ourselves if we were just using Node by itself. Cool?
Yep, good.
So you can think of the routes as kind of like you can think of it as an if case of like if the method is post and the URL is this, then do this. But you can also think about it as kind of virtually defining a file, right? We're kind of defining this /contact. We're defining that contact file in code to some degree as well. because I can do anything in response to that route. It doesn't have to be just say, here, render a view, or here, send back this HTML file that I have. It could be go to the database and get things and then generate a string that comes back to the server. Comes back to the client. So it can be a lot more. Okay. That's kind of what I had. Any other questions? Does that help put the kind of the different pieces in context with where they land?
Yeah.
That's neat.
So you'll build up this mental model over time to kind of understand where all the pieces fit. But it does take a little bit to kind of get used to it. So I'll be here for labs. If you have any questions, ask me. And again, the calendar's out there. It's updated on Inside Ranken. If you haven't done your attendance post, please do that. But there's the stuff out there to watch for Handlebars and Heroku and such.
All right, well, I'm gonna go get to it. Thanks.
Yep, thanks.
No problem.
I appreciate that little lecture. I do think that helped me a lot with trying to understand all of it.